My pleasure. My name is Paul Karz, and I'm an interpreter with California State Parks. I know I'm wearing the uniform. I look like a ranger. The difference between me and a ranger is a ranger has a sidearm here that forces you to listen what I'm saying. And today, I just have to do it based upon my talents. So I'm stationed. I've spent over 25 years as an interpreter and a volunteer for California State Parks, and now I'm out of Seacliff State Beach and also lead hikes inside of Nisene Marks. I see several faces here of people who have been on hikes with me. So what I'd like to begin with is, as we look around here, you guys see these redwood trees, and I know many of you have redwoods on your properties. And the thing about redwoods is they have superpowers. And when I say that, let's talk about a little bit of history here. So human beings have been on this planet for about 200,000 years. And before that, you got marine fossils over in Seacliff that have been around about 5 million years. And you've got dinosaurs, remember Jurassic Park, been around for about 65 million years. But these redwoods, they've been around for 250 million years. So for something to be around that long, they have to be survivors. And they're survivors because they have superpowers. And some of the superpowers, well, you guys know what they are, and that's what makes them valuable. That's what makes them red gold. That's what the history of these mountains here is based upon, is their superpowers. So if I think about it, and you look at the bark on these things, and you take a piece of bark, you notice there's not a lot of resin in that bark. And if you look at it, it also holds a lot of moisture, which means that these guys are fire resistant. And if you've been over to Big Basin and see the CZU fire, you'll see that the little trees burned, but the big ones are now starting to do side sprouting that got burnt. So they're coming back. So they're fire resistant. The other thing, if you listen real carefully, nobody talk for a moment, and tell me how many birds you hear around here. You don't hear a lot of birds, do you? And that's because the bark on these trees have the same chemical that's in your black tea and red wine, and that is tannic acid. And so bugs don't like tannic acid. No bugs, no birds. So now that's not exclusively true. We also have a lot of owls around here, a lot of hawks. You got some bats up here, but generally you don't get a lot of songbirds. And that tannic acid is the other reason why all of us like our fences out of redwood and our houses out of redwood, because they last a long time. Who here has a septic tank out of redwood? A couple of you do. And that septic tank's pretty old. Again, redwood lasts for a long time. So another superpower. The other thing is these things grow really tall and really straight. The tallest one grows that I'm aware of is about 389 feet. And the reason why they grow so tall is because they got to reach the light, get above the forest canopy. Again, another survival thing. Anybody know why they can't grow higher than 400 feet? Any engineers here? Hydrostatic pressure. You can't draw water up more than 400 feet at this tour here. So again, that makes them a superpower as well. There's also a couple other things, like the way they reproduce. They can reproduce by seed, which is about 15%, and they can reproduce by basal cells around the base. When you cut one of these down, you get new trees popping up all around the base, right? And all those trees that pop up around the base, all those are clones. They're exactly genetically the same as the regular tree here. So that's the reason why these guys have been around for 250 million years. So let's go a little bit forward in history here. Now, in this area here, there was people living here for about 10,000 years. Any guess who that was? Ohlone, that's right. And there's about 50 different tribes of Ohlone. Now, in Nisene Marks, we had 2 tribes, and the language of that area was called Awaswas. So one of the tribes was named after a chief, Chief Soquel, so you have the Soquel tribe, and the other one, and there's a debate on this. I say it was named after the mouth of two rivers, and in Awaswas, that word is Aptos. And some people say it actually means the people. So, since I'm giving the presentation today, it's the mouth of two rivers. So, at Nisene Marks, you had two tribes of indigenous people that lived in that area for 10,000 years. You had the Aptos tribe, who are more on the south side of Nisene Marks, and you had the Soquel tribe on the north side. And so, before we begin any kind of presentation, we always like to take a moment to acknowledge that the lands that we're on right now were the original traditional homelands of the Awaswas-speaking tribes of the Ohlone people. And we like to give thanks for our ability to live, learn, teach, and steward on their traditional homelands. So our story really begins about 200 years ago. There was a group led by Juan Bautista Anza. It was called the Anza Expedition. And it started off in Sinaloa, Mexico, and it went all the ways up to the Presidio. And in this expedition, this was the first pioneers to come to California. And in this expedition, there was about 400 oxen, mules, and horses, and about 300 cows. And there was 240 people. And that 240 people, of that 240 people, 100 were children. Can you imagine walking from Sinaloa, Mexico, all the ways up to San Francisco with no sidewalks, no streets, and with 100 kids? Are we there yet? So in that group, you had the first Castro to come to California, and that was Ysidro Castro. Now, Ysidro was a soldier, and he went up to San Francisco, and he brought his son. And the age of the son, I've heard anywhere from 5 to 8 years old, came up with him, and that was Joaquin Castro. And so we're going to focus a little bit about Joaquin Castro. So this was in 1776. You know what was happening on the other coast at that time. Over here, we have pioneers coming up here, and you have Ysidro Castro up at Presidio, and his son Joaquin grows up to be just like his dad. He becomes a soldier. And he's a soldier over in Branch 40. He turns into a major domo in charge of the mission. And so the family is involved with the military, as is all the other Spanish that came up here. Well, then between about 1810 and 1821, Mexico and Spain go to war with each other. Mexico wants its independence. Now you have the Spanish that are pure at heart, and you have the Mexicans here in California that are made up of mestizos, Spanish that are born here, and even some of the indigenous people that have families within that have mixed with the Spanish here. And they want their independence. And Mexico gets its independence in 1822. Well, you have a lot of these families that were involved with that period of time. And Joaquin Castro, again, we're talking Joaquin here, he and his family were given land grants here in California. So let's talk about these land grants. These land grants were given around 1833, and a land grant was usually a rancho. And on these ranchos, the main purpose of the ranchos, they were grasslands that went from the ocean back towards the forest. And these grasslands, they raised the only export out of California from 1833 to 1847. Anybody know what that was? Hides. That's right. Hides and tallow. Now, what happened was you had these ranchos, and they raised all these cows, and they would drive the cows to the ocean, and they would sell them to these brigs that went up and down. They would slaughter the cattle down there, and they would sell them. They were called California banknotes. You could get $2 for a hide, and that was a lot of money back then. And so they would stretch the hides, and they'd sell them to these brigs, and then they'd take the tallow, and the tallow would go to South America, where they would process it into soap and candles. But the hides went around South America, and they came up around the east coast of the United States, And they were made into saddles and shoes, but they were also responsible for the, helping to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Wait a minute, how can a cowhide fuel the Industrial Revolution? That makes no sense. Well, let's think about it. You've got these big wheels, these big machines turning, and they got to connect to each other. And what do they connect with? Leather belts. And so leather was a real important asset to the Industrial Revolution. So you had the Castros that were raising cattle. And so let's talk about the Castro family, specifically two of the members of the family. We had Rafael Castro, who owned Rancho Aptos, which was on one side of Nisene Marks. And then you had his sister, who was Martina Castro, who owned Rancho Soquel on the other side. Now, Rancho Aptos was about 8,000 acres, and it was grasslands and then some of the forest. And then Rancho Soquel was about 1,600 acres. It was grassland and a little bit of forest. And so Martina, hey, first of all, it was really neat that women owned land, because after 1850, when California became a state, women didn't necessarily own land. But before then, you had Martina Castro, who owned 1,600 acres. Now, she was a smart lady. I saw pictures of her, and I still don't understand how she got married 3 times. And she had 12 kids, so the third guy that married her, I'm not sure what that was all about. But anyway, she went to the governor of California, and she said, I've got 1,600 acres in my land grant. I need more land. My cows are falling off the cliff. You got to help me. Well, the governor was, I guess he sort of humored her. He says, okay, here's 32,000 acres. It's all yours. And it was nothing but redwoods. Cows can't eat redwoods, but you know who got the last laugh on that one. So then, and that was the Soquel augmentation. So she owned Rancho Soquel, and then she got the Rancho Soquel augmentation, which was a good portion of Nisene Marks. So let's go back over to Rafael Castro. Now, Rafael was a really smart man. He was a businessman. And what he did was he leased his land out to different people to be used for different things. And he leased out the front part of his forest to a guy by the name of Titus Hall. And Titus, the first year there, he harvested, and you guys would know what this means, he harvested 4,000 cords of oak. Can you imagine 4 by 4 by 8, 4,000 cords? And that was taken up to San Francisco, and they claimed that was the best firewood they ever had. Now they're starting to come into the front part of Nisene Marks. And then Rafael leased another portion of it to some Frenchmen who put a mill on the front part of the river there, Aptos Creek, and that mill did about 1,400 board feet per day. It was a water mill. Now, to give you an idea how much 1,400 square feet of board feet is, a home would take about 14,000 board feet to build. So it was a small mill. So he also was responsible for putting the wharf at the end of Wharf Road near Aptos Creek, and that was to ship out hides and lumber. Then he made friends with a guy by the name of Klaus Spreckels. I'm sure you guys have heard of Klaus Spreckels, Spreckels Sugar. And Klaus Spreckels was a pretty smart guy. He came from Germany. In New York, he got into the brewery business. And then when he came out here, he got into the sugar business. And so what Klaus Spreckels would do is he would sail a ship to Hawaii, get sugar cane, bring it back over here, and he would manufacture sugar from sugar cane either in Watsonville or over where Nob Hill is in Aptos, and there was 2 mills there. So that was one way he made his money. But Klaus was also a smart guy as far as he was the one who brought in sugar beets into California. and he was also the one who financed the first railroad from Santa Cruz to Watsonville, the Santa Cruz Railroad. And so he was involved with that aspect of it. So Raphael sold a lot of his land to Klaus, and then Klaus got together with, and they started to do some logging in there, more logging, and most of that logging was used for housing and things like that. But you had the expansion from the east coming to the west here, and that was trains, and you're building train tracks everywhere. So what do you need for train tracks? Wood. You need ties. And what's the best kind of wood for a tie? Something that's impervious to insects, something that doesn't catch fire, and something that lasts 100 years. That's redwood. So the Southern Pacific came in, and they brought in with them the Loma Prieta Lumber Company. And when the Southern Pacific came in, first of all, the first train in the area and the first trains into Nisene Marks were narrow gauge, 36-inch wide. Narrow gauge follows the contour of the land. But Southern Pacific and the big railroads, they didn't care about the contour of the land. They just push a line right through. So they brought in a team of Chinese who built the trains across the U.S. They built 7.5 miles of wide gauge, which is about 56.5 inches wide, through the center part of Nisene Marks. And they did most of their, and they put 11 trestles in there, and they started taking the big trees out of there. Now, it took about a week to get a big tree out of there. When do you think they fell the trees? Any guesses? Would you fall them in the summertime, spring, fall? When do you think you would fall them? In the winter. What they would do is they cut the trees down in the winter. They would take the shakes off of them. They cut them into small sections because you couldn't pull the trees out. The ground was too soft. It was too muddy. So they would wait till the summertime when the ground firmed up, and then they would bring in oxen and mules, and they would drag sections of trees down. So what they would do is they start logging along the creek, and then they slowly work their way up the sides of the hill and let gravity work with them, and they would take the logs out. Now, Nisene Marks was, the big logging took place during 1883 to 1923. And during that time, they took out 140 million board feet of wood out of there. And so all that logging, they basically clear cut that forest. And if you were to look at a picture of the forest at that time, most of the forest there wasn't any trees left. And so somebody came up with a brilliant idea. Well, this looks pretty bad. Maybe we should plant something back in here. So they planted 50 acres of eucalyptus, along with 30,000 eucalyptus seedlings, and because they were fast growing. What people didn't realize that eucalyptus is very fire prone, and when it dries, it twists, and so that was a bad idea. But a redwood forest, like I said, they're survivors. And what happened? The forest came back. Within 120 years, if you go into Nisene Marks, you won't notice anything different. If you didn't know the forest had been logged, it looks just like this. And as I look around here, I see stumps around here that have been logged, and yet you still have a forest, a redwood forest that has come back in here. So the Castros, just a little sidebar about the Castros and the families at that time. So you had these Spanish families that owned these ranchos. They were very prosperous. If you were to go to a rancho, and that was the only thing in the area, and you were a visitor, what they would do is they would welcome you. It's not like today, get off my property. Who do you think you are? It's not like that. Back then it was, oh, you're a stranger. Come on. Your horse looks tired. We'll trade horses with you. Come on inside. We'll give you a meal. And tonight, we'll do a fandango with you, which is a party. And then what they probably do is send the vaqueros out and capture a wild grizzly bear and a wild bull, and they would have a bear and bull fight in your honor. Now, I know that's not PC for today, but back then, remember, where you're sitting right now, you wouldn't be sitting here back then because there'd be grizzly bears running around here. They were the top predator. And so they would do that. So that was the Spanish during that time. But what happened was, in 1850, suddenly California becomes a state. And what's the language in the state? It goes from being Spanish to English on that day. So now you have these dons that own these ranchos, that own these woods, these cattle, and their land grants from Spain don't mean much to a lot of people because now this is America. So you had people coming from the East Coast settling here on their property. The borders were a little bit indeterminate. And so what they did, first of all, I got to ask, how many people in here are lawyers? Okay. And I'm sure you're an honest one, right? Okay. So back then, the lawyers were not very honest. And so what they would do is they would charge the dons on the lands, they would charge them land in order to defend them in court. Remarkably, they never won. But they were able to get most of the land from the dons, and so about by 1870, the dons were bankrupt. Now, going back to Raphael and Martina, they were smart. Raphael sold his land off. Martina diversified her land to her children, and so they were able to hold on to a lot of their holdings at that time. Coming forward, there were several other logging companies that went into Nisene Marks, and like I said, they logged until 1923. 1922, again, when I mentioned how they fell the trees in the wintertime, they would take all the brush, so when the tree came down, it fell on the brush, that way they wouldn't splinter, and then they would burn the forest floor, be able to drag things out. Well, in 1922, while doing that, they accidentally ended up burning 7,000 acres of Nisene Marks. But that was the last time they logged in there. That isn't to say that they didn't take logs out of there, because from about 1923 to about 1927, they were still pulling logs out of the mill pond. There was 2 mills inside that, inside of Nisene Marks. You had the Rio del Mar mill, and then you had the Loma Prieta mill. And the mill ponds, the logs would sink to the bottom, and even though the mills were closed, they still had hundreds of logs in the mill ponds. In addition to that, you had a group of Italian loggers who went in there and would peel the oak off the bark off the oak trees, the tan oak, for the tanneries. And so they were still pulling stuff out of there at that time. Now, during this logging period, in the late 80s, you had a town that was built in there, which was Loma Prieta, and it was a very prosperous town. There was about 300 people in there. There was a school, there was a church, a bar, a post office, and if you lived in Chicago, you could take a train from Chicago to the town of Loma Prieta and vacation there. So, you know, some people say, why would you want to vacation in the forest? Well, my wife just got us a reservation in the Forest of Mendocino, so I guess it's just, you know, it's pretty common still. So there was the town of Loma Prieta in there, and the town was deserted after 23. People said, well, what happened to the town? Well, think about this. You live up here, you're building a house. Are you going to go buy fireplace bricks? Are you going to buy cut wood? Wait a minute, I know a place in the forest here that has chimneys and wood. So a lot of it was scavenged out. And then in 46, arson set the town on fire. And so there was not much left of it. That's what happened to the town of Loma Prieta. But it was a pretty neat place. When you look at the town, it wasn't your typical lumber town. The buildings were painted. And even the foreman's house, Porter, he was an administrator. His house had a piano in it, and he ultimately became lieutenant governor of California. He was an administrator there. Anyway, moving forward, around 1948, they did a couple of test wells in there for oil. And they, you know, there was a taste of it, but not enough to make it worthwhile. Well, there was a family, the Marks family, who were farmers over in Salinas. I think they were egg farmers. And they decided that they were going to buy 8,000 acres of Nisene Marks because there might be oil there. Well, like I said, they did the test drills. No oil was discovered there. And so between 1950 and 1954, they bought about 8,000 acres. They held on to it, and then in 1963, they sold it to the Land Trust, and then the Sierra Club added another 1,000 acres to it, bringing it up to about almost 10,000 acres, and at that time, it was sold to the state. Now, there was 4 conditions that they sold it. The first one was no horses past the metal bridge there, and I think that had to do with one of the family members, being thrown off a horse. So no horses past this steel bridge. The second thing was that it had to be open to everybody. And then the third thing was that anything man-made had to be taken out of the park because they wanted it to be natural. And then the fourth thing is that the park had to be named after the mother, Nisene. So therefore, if you go to look for information about the forest, the name of the forest is, I got to put quote marks here, the Forest of Nisene Marks State Parks. So if you look for Nisene Marks or you look for Forest of Nisene Marks, you might not find it, but it's called the Forest of Nisene Marks. And there's 40 different trails in the park. There's almost 15 or 16 different entrances in the park. And when the park was closed and I had to stand at the main entrance to make sure people didn't come in, there were still people coming in from different parts. So it's accessible from the land of the Medicine Buddha, Old San Jose Road, from all sides of it, from the demonstration forest over here. And it's a really wonderful place. We have steelhead that are starting to come back inside there. And in fact, 3 months ago, I saw a 12-inch steelhead in the stream. We're seeing some mountain lions come back inside there. So it's a great resource to the public, especially on that side of the hill. It was one of the best kept secrets in Santa Cruz County until COVID, when all the parks shut down. And the only place you could go was the forest. And all of a sudden we had everybody who came to Nisene Marks. So it's become very discovered. And we're trying to work real hard with the advocates in there in order to improve the trails. And there is a plan, if you've been there, to get rid of the 2 pit toilets and get some real facilities inside that forest. Yes?
Why are horses not allowed past the bridge?
Again, that had to go back with a condition when the Marks family sold it to the state. We think that somebody in the Marks family had an episode with a horse while hiking in there, so they made that a condition of the sale. Huh?
That's a condition of the sale.
Yeah. And for what they sold the park to the state, I don't think anybody was going to argue with it. I think, I don't remember what the exact sum was, but it was less than $1 million for 8,000 acres. So the park is, there's a lot of bicycling in there now, a lot of hiking in there. The creeks are running clear, and I really encourage you folks, when you get an opportunity and you get time, come on over the other side of the hill and visit the Forest of Nisene Marks. I will share with you 2 other things, since I'm up here and I've got the microphone. Today is open house at Rancho San Andreas Castro Adobe. Who's been to the Castro Adobe? Okay, a couple of you had. So I will share with you 2 of the best kept secrets. The Rancho Castro Adobe. If you're going down Highway 1 and you get off on Buena Vista, you go under the freeway, you make a left on Larkin Valley, and immediately there's Old Adobe Road. That'll lead you up to a 2-story adobe hacienda, probably about, I'd say it's about 1,800 square feet. Both ends of the building came down during the '89 earthquake, but a group of volunteers got together, made 2,500 adobe bricks that were this wide, this long, this thick. Each one weighed 80 pounds, and they had to be flipped every 3 days. And they found out they only needed to make it that big, but that was afterwards. And they rebuilt the building. And again, this was one of Joaquin Castro's, this was his original place built by his son, Juan Jose. The building's incredible. It's been totally restored. It's totally furbished. It's in the country, and it's beautiful gardens. It's not open to the public except for open houses and school groups. In fact, I think a couple of your school groups have been down there. The Loma Prieta school groups have been in there. So I encourage you there. The other thing that I'll share with you that I've just discovered recently, again, new to the state park system, is who's been to Big Sur Lighthouse? Okay, so the Big Sur Lighthouse is right before you get to Big Sur. There's a big mountain right on the ocean there, and at the very top is the lighthouse. And that in itself is pretty amazing. You can walk to the top, or they'll take a little cart that will get you to the top. And so that particular, I mean, that's pretty cool. But what's more cool than that is right next door to it, there is area with concertina barbed wire fence and a sign that says "Do not trespass government property." Well, that was sold to state parks in 2000, and it was a naval base, miniature naval base that has no name because it was a super secret Cold War naval base. And when you go on there, it's open on the weekends, same time that the lighthouse is. You go through the first gate to get you on the base. You go through a second base to get you through a secure area. And then you go through the third gate to get to this building that's right along the coast. And out of that building, there used to be 3 cables. One that was 10 miles, one that was 15 miles, and one that was 20 miles out to the ocean. At the end of it, there was a microphone. And in this building, you had these guys sitting there 24/7 listening for Russian subs going up and down the coast. And they could tell by the resonance of the propeller which sub it was. So anybody here see the Hunt for Red October? That's the story about it. So anyway, the Russians found out we were listening, and it got defunct. But while they were listening, and this is where my part comes in with state parks, they had a scientist working there. And these guys would be sitting there at the console late at night, and all of a sudden they would hear this noise that they never heard before. And the scientist was sitting there, and he listened to it. And he was the one that discovered whale songs. And that's how they discovered whale songs, was at these listening posts. And in fact, he was the one who made the album that sold like 47 copies, but he just died about 6 months ago. So anyway, that's another new state park. And then finally, who's been over to Seacliff State Beach?
What's left of it?
Okay, so Seacliff State Beach is where we have a ship made out of concrete. And if you've never seen a ship made out of concrete, that's a great place to go. We got hit really hard during the January storms. During the January storms, it took out the RV camping area, took out the picnic area, and took out half the pier going to the concrete ship. We had to take out the other part of it. So right now, we're getting back online for the public use. The RV camping area probably won't be open for a while. The picnic area is open immediately now. We finally got that open. And the pier, we had to take out the rest of the pier. People ask, are you going to rebuild the pier? And I don't have an official word, but the state of California is $29 billion in deficit. Are they going to prioritize building a pier that goes nowhere? Probably not. So that probably won't happen. But the ship is still there. It will always be there because it's a sanctuary for birds and for sea animals underneath. So I encourage you to come to Seacliff State Beach. I work at the visitor center there, and tonight we have our first movie on the beach. and it's going to be the Muppets movie Treasure Island. And so I encourage you, if you got kids, and if you don't, come on down to Seacliff State Beach and enjoy the Muppet movie. And with that, thank you very much for letting me have some of your time and spend your afternoon with you.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, give him a big hand. He really deserves it. He's come a long ways.